Waiting. And we are live. Good evening.
Hiram Enoch.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Father.
This is Hiram Enoch.
This is Deacon Joseph Suey. This is Orthodox Apologetics Live, where we answer questions about defending the Orthodox faith, and sometimes we just answer everything else. So, okay, well, how are you doing today, Father?
I'm doing all right. How you doing?
We're doing. Up until yesterday, we had this thing listed as untitled. Good evening. We'll just write that to everyone in the chat. And it's we're heading towards the last days of the Apostles' Fast. It ends this week, finally, and we are going to. We put up yesterday that it was an untitled program because we didn't know exactly what topics to do, so we threw the question out on the War Zone and got quite enough responses that we can call this episode Chop Suey, because what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one, give an overview, if it can't be answered quickly, and start talking about it as a future episode. So, let me see here.
All right. Okay, so what's the first topic?
All right. Well, we go getting right into it. The first topic is, it is, should we use names? I don't know. We'll just use first names. Okay, so we got Daniel, the 3 chapters controversy, an anti-Chalcedonian rejection of Chalcedon on the basis it's supposedly endorsing Nestorian works. This may be retreading old ground, though. Father, you wrote a response on that, and then we can expand it. You want to read it, or should I?
Basically, it's an interesting subject. There's a whole lot of material, primary source material from the 400s and 500s. I think Daniel's just asking to go through it again. The 3 chapters controversy. And well, first off, Ibis of Edessa, people forget, he always denied he wrote the letter, so-called letter. And that's kind of what they're really talking about is the letter of Ibis of Edessa. Now, people forget, Ibis of Edessa's enemies tried to depose him like 4 different trials.
Yeah.
All right. And they only succeeded at the one shortly before Chalcedon happened. Okay. Because every time they would bring him before a trial, I didn't write that letter. You have no proof. I didn't write it. Like, he got brought before Patriarch St. Domnus of Antioch, and the Patriarch was like, no, he didn't. There's no evidence he did any of this. All right. And so at one point, it was almost like his enemies were like writing things for him. How do you say, forging texts. So now what happened at one trial in Tyre, there was a trial in Tyre, which was like the 3rd time they tried to. So it's kind of uncanonical. They're trying to try him 3 different times for the same exact charge on the same exact material, and he was declared innocent the 2 previous times. I mean, you're not supposed to do that. And so I think that the emperor sent judges. There was like this agreement, because technically, according to the canons of Carthage, which is kind of a more universal principle, a bishop or a priest does have the right, if his opponents agree to it, that they can have mediators, common mediators appointed, if you don't want to go through the whole 12 or 13 bishop judges route, all right? And so they had imperial magistrates and other bishops that were appointed to hear the case, because Ibis was like, well, I think the emperor is neutral, if he can, and everybody kind of agreed to that. And they started bringing all these quotations out. Supposedly, they claimed Ibis of Edessa had said that he thought he could become God just like Christ could become God, which was not what Ibis said. He was making a talk about theosis, and they kind of took things he said out of context. And then the letter of Edessa came up. I mean, the letter to Maris the Persian, and Ibis simply said, "No, I didn't write that, and I don't know who wrote it, but it's not me." And and then what happened at the end of Tyre, which I think was the 4th time, the 3rd time they tried to try him for the exact same charge, and they failing, was Ibis basically said at the end of it that he would, he had no problem with Saint Kirill, he had no problem with the teachings of Saint Kirill. That the only reason he had initially censured Saint Kirill was that Patriarch John of Antioch had done that with all the bishops, so he just went along with the Patriarch. But after the union was proclaimed in 433 between Patriarch John of Antioch and St. Kirill, there was no reason for anything. Now, the problem was that the so-called letter of Ibis was made or modified to seem like it was written after the union. So that way they could kind of say, well, Ibis is still attacking St. Kirill in some backhanded way. But again, Ibis always denied it. And one of the trials, maybe the third or fourth trial, Ibis simply said, "I'm not agreeing to anything. This is I want to have a council and a larger council hear my case." I think at the Latrocinium he was uncanonically deposed at the Latrocinium, if I recall.
Yeah.
And so when Chalcedon was held to basically correct a lot of the Latrocinium abuses. So the concept that they would read material from that trial, including the so-called letter to Maris and all this other stuff, the concept that they would read trials transcripts from previous decisions, and then Ibis would just simply be asked, do you accept the teachings of the council, and do you accept all these other things, and not be asked to, because it would be, I think what was happening was Ibis had gotten to the point where he was being asked to deny something for the fifth time that he had not written, and he had already denied it several times before. And so I think I don't know if actually he didn't, the Monophysites sometimes say is he wasn't made to explicitly deny he had written the letter at Chalcedon, but the problem is that he denied it at least probably 12 times before, not just in trials, but in other letters. All right? So the bishops of Chalcedon felt no need to make him deny it for 10th time, as long as he agreed to everything that the council taught. All right? So, but, the Severians kind of continually bring this subject up.
I think it's worth devoting an episode to, just so we can review all of the primary sources.
And remember, this is why, for example, the Fifth Ecumenical Council says the so-called letter of Ibis.
Right. But it's worth an episode. I think we agree. So definitely that's something we'll follow up on. Got a question in the group. This was actually asked, I think, yesterday or the day before. Hello to Timer Mildred, by the way. And now this was Jordan Brown asking here. And I believe he asked...
Is it an apologetics question?
Well, it says, do you mind comparing the Western liturgical rites used in Rome or the Antiochian Vicariate in the metropolis? Also, can we discuss other ancient Eastern rites besides Byzantine?
Can we go through? That's an interesting point, but can we go through the apologetics suggestions first, and then get to?
I don't know when to put in the live one, so I figured that just popped up. So I thought I would.
It's an interesting point, but let's focus on the apologetics questions first, and then we can go to the other questions.
Okay, so Jordan, we'll get to this. We'll get to this one after we finish with the ones off the war zone. So we will do. Okay.
So Daniel asks again. His other suggestion for an episode was an episode about the role and place of the Pope in the first millennium of the Church against Roman Catholic claims.
Yeah, I think that's. I think it's a great topic. Because a lot of, from our perspective as Orthodox, to understand an Orthodox Pope of Rome is really just having a Pope of Rome in the West, and again with the condition of the Western liturgical rites that they were using, structurally not being that different from the Church of today, and in the Orthodox Church of today, in the sense that the Pope, being the highest primate, had a voice for the Church, but past that, he had I guess you could say what's the word that we always appellate jurisdiction, and then past that, he just did his own thing and really focused on the maintenance of the churches under his diocese.
Now, it should also be noted that technically, the Pope had even before the schism, had a kind of a veto power on metropolitans. But technically, that's not that much different than other like the Patriarch of Antioch, because a patriarch has the right to agree to the election who's elected to be the head of an autonomous metropolia. For example, if the Archbishop of Canterbury in 700 was, like, say, he was elected, if he wanted to have the pallium, the Pope had to agree to the election. All right, but I know people bring that up every now and again as supposedly an extension of papal supremacy or power, but it's, to be honest, not that different than, let's say, there were, like, for example, in Central Asia during the 800s, there were large numbers of, believe it or not, there were a lot of Nestorians, bishops, and things, but there were also something like 80 or 100 Orthodox bishops in the whole Uzbekistan, Central Asia area. It's not really talked about, but they were under the Patriarch of Antioch, and they had something like 3 or 4 Catholicoses. And a Catholicos is kind of like a chief primate metropolitan of an autonomous church. All right, But when a Catholicos was elected by the other metropolitans of that autonomous church, the Patriarch of Antioch had to give his consent. If he didn't, then there was the election of the Catholicos wasn't considered valid. All right. But do you see my point that that's similar to the Pope approving, let's say, metropolitan primates in the West? It doesn't. It's a lot of times people make claims about papal authority in the ancient church when it was really something that patriarchs in other jurisdictions would exercise too. So, okay, what's the next point, Paul?
Okay, well, now Timur put one. It's a good question. We're going to go through the list on Facebook first, and then we're going to touch on the ones in the chat. So the next one on that one goes to Larry. Anthropological divergence, soteriology. I've noticed that these tend to be the greatest difference in coming over from Rome. Many may claim a doctrinal continuity with divinization, but I know nothing of this like the spiritual daily goals of Orthodox. While I was still Catholic, I more knew the truth of Orthodox daily life and taught by the saints and elders of modernity in comparison with the Church of Rome, as all the pseudo-churches of Western Europe, as per Justin Popovich in his essay Humanistic Ecumenism, more would see Orthodoxy as something less foreign or ethnic. And I responded to the point, I think it's important to note that the loss of the Orthodox sense after the schism in no way detracts from the fact that Orthodoxy shines in the fathers of the West before the schism, because I don't want it to become a West versus East thing as opposed to an Orthodoxy versus heresy thing. But I definitely think that one topic that can definitely come out of that is, and I think that this is kind of also fits with that whole thing that Daniel mentioned about the role and place of the Pope in the first millennium, the spirituality of the Orthodox West versus the Roman Catholic West from their own teachers. I think is actually a pretty good topic for a show.
Yes.
And so, yeah, that's definitely something that we're going to do.
The anthropological divergence question is interesting because generally that's kind of good. We're going to get to we're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about Feimer's question. But anyway, let's go. Continue.
Hold on 1 second, please, Father.
Okay.
Well, actually, if you could, yeah, just I have to step away from the desk for a moment.
Okay, I'll just read the rest of the suggestions on Facebook, and then I'll go to the questions. All right. See, someone suggested it's not really an apologetics suggestion, but they suggested discussing an article about Russian Orthodox religious instruction being part of Russian public school education now. I mean, yes, that happens in Russia. I mean, they had religious education in Greek schools actually until what, like the 1980s or so, and various people complained about it because, at least in Greece, I believe, because a lot of people didn't feel the teachers really believed in it. I don't know if I don't necessarily think that's a bad way. If you're an Orthodox state, you should still have it, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm not. It's not a bad thing. It's just not really an apologetics question.
Now, the other question people talk. I mean, this is related to the whole gay pride and straight pride counter parades and the homosexual marriage. Well, first off, the Orthodox Church is absolutely against gay marriage, gay anything, homosexual stuff. That is totally contrary from the very foundations of creation, when God made things to nature. All right, so the Orthodox Church will never recognize gay anything.
And any Orthodox church that claims to do
then it apostatizes, it ceases to be a church. It's nothing if they do that.
The concept is very simple that, marriage is...
And this whole thing they keep on bringing up about the supposed brotherhood rights and whatever, it's so blasphemous. If you read the Pedalion actually has a section where I think it condemns the brotherhood rights.
Yeah.
Because it says originally it was like a form of adoption.
Yeah.
But then people started using it as cover for gay stuff. And the patriarch is like, nope, this is done. We're done with this. Because in Orthodox countries like in Byzantium and in Roman Orthodox Rome, they did not tolerate this. They found you doing, maybe not to be vulgar, but the reason the word faggot actually comes into our terms is because of the Theodosian laws, where in the time of the Emperor St. Theodosius, if they caught people engaging in sodomy, gay sodomy, that kind of stuff, they would tie bundles of sticks to you, set them on fire, and you'd have to run around like the hippodrome or something like that. All right. Now, they may have not always executed people like that, but there was a large-scale abhorrence to that
I always thought it was because of the cigarette thing.
The cigarettes, well, I mean, I don't know. I think it's because they burn people at the stake if they caught them doing that stuff. And bundles of sticks are called faggots.
Well, so are cigarettes. It is.
I don't know. Do they burn people at the stake too with cigarettes? I don't know. That's what I thought. That's what my reading, my historical reading of it was. It was for that reason, not to.
You're right though, because if you think about it, a cigarette is a burning stick.
So. Yeah. So and exactly. So, but a burning bundle of sticks is called a faggot, and so
we're still going to get thrown off of YouTube.
Yeah, maybe, but that's an historical discussion there. All right. My point was there was that much
faggotry.
Yes, there was so much importance to that in old Christian societies that they treated things like that. Now, the judge, a Byzantine judge, didn't have to necessarily give you the death penalty. He might simply have you publicly beaten or, shamed and then driven out of the community, all right, or something like that. So, anyway, but this whole gay pride stuff, this is just so disturbing. It's sick that this has happened in the community, but it's kind of the outworking of the ideas that came about centuries previously, where it's all about the individual's ability to express himself, and society should have no means of controlling him. And that's definitely an anti-Orthodox position.
Well,
and
to quote the Roman Catholic historian Will Durant, which I will rarely do, but it was in the beginning of the movie Apocalypto, so I do recommend that. Society can't be destroyed from without until it's destroyed from within. So there are two ways this can go down. It could actually go down that, God sends the apocalypse down and the end is near. That is one possibility. The other possibility, which has occurred many times in history, is that our empire simply gets overrun by one that's not as morally corrupt, and eventually we're all under a caliph or something.
Or it's even different. It could be, to get in modern political stuff, it could be, the more Hispanic immigrants, they don't like this stuff.
Yeah, that's true too.
It could be like the Mexican community is going to like. It could be like the crazy white people doing all this stuff there. And now we're going to roll because they're all effeminate, people. I don't know.
They're working on Latino communities very hard to make them into.
Yeah, you're right. They have been trying to do that. I know they've been trying to do that to the black community, but that's not been too successful there too. But maybe they're. I don't know. But my point was that. In these other countries, if to get back onto the subject, like in Russia and all this other stuff,
this is
they don't. And part of it's partially because that I'm not defending. Obviously, the communist regimes are deplorable, but there was this initial attempt, like in the 1920s, to promote a bunch of the gay stuff, or at least some kind of way legitimize it in the Marxist-Leninist states in the Soviet Union. But there was just so much reaction to that they basically dropped it almost immediately. And then Stalin brought back some of the laws, and then that kind of continued. Now they kind of counterbalanced that by having abortion on demand, which kind of also destroyed their society from an entirely different angle, which they're still having that major problem.
Birth control. So
but though interestingly, Ceausescu in Romania made abortion illegal, because he wanted the population to be bigger and all this other stuff. But I think it's almost this weird scenario where the Western NATO liberal type countries were forced by their almost governing structures to kind of accept all this stuff gradually, even though it was not a groundswell of support. It was almost like a top-down thing from the schools and all the other stuff. But the communist countries came out a little bit better after communism failed than the supposedly freer countries. So that just shows you that there are grave spiritual elements from both, the supposed Western liberal model and the communist model that can be equally destructive to everything. But no, we don't accept any of that gay crap, and it's got to be put down. But it may not be, and it may just simply they have to do. Well, have you ever seen those YouTube things about
made it sound like Old Yeller there.
They gotta be put down. Well, I don't.
Now we're gonna be accused of complete fascism.
Exactly. Well, the problem is anybody who defends a normative moral position is considered fascist. It just makes the word meaningless. But it's a similar look in these African countries too. People like to criticize them. Yeah, they do not. They don't accept any of this. And in fact, when Obama went to Kenya and he was like talking about gay this and that was like the Kenyan prime minister was like, please don't talk to us about this, not about this. We don't like this. We don't want it in our country. You can come and visit it. But if you try to do this again, you're not welcome here. All right. And, it seems to be only like kind of Western countries that
It is, and they're in decline. So the point
Yeah.
is, we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It would be awfully romantic of us to assume that the end of Europe is the end of the world. But it's also not always necessarily realistic, because there's still the largest growth areas for Christianity are in Asia and Africa right now.
Yeah,
and
so like in a country, and even in countries that are kind of between third and second world, or kind of getting on the verge of being first world, like the Philippines, for example, that's kind of like between a first, third, maybe it's got third world areas, it's got first world areas. You know what I mean? It's kind of a strange situation.
It's a struggle between.
Yeah, but in a country like the Philippines, but similar to other countries too, they don't. The majority of the population does not accept this stuff. It's only a few people, elites in Manila and these other places that try to promote this stuff.
Yeah.
And then like Duterte tried to like be kind of pro-gay initially, but then like he had to really go back on that.
Well, he was gay, and then he changed.
Yeah, exactly. And who knows exactly what the truth is about him? But my point is that there's a lot of evil going on, and
well, he also talked about eating terrorists. So I don't know. I mean, I get the logic, but still, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But anyway, all right. Let's get back to the topic.
Okay, so Ethan asks the question. Maybe you could discuss the prevalence of word concept fallacy quote mining from the fathers that is ubiquitous in online polemics, and discuss some common examples. For example, filioque proof text, papal supremacy proof texts, Protestant using control F, faith alone, or control F symbol. I think that's a computer argument.
Control F is the find key. So in other words, they'll go to a patristic page and they'll try to find the words faith alone or symbol, or sola fide, or denial of the sacrament.
Okay.
I mean, we do this every week, basically at least once, because there's always some proof text that's done awfully, and yeah, but we can talk about the process, and unfortunately, ultimately it's the same for Protestants and Roman Catholics, except Protestants were limited to the Bible and the early Church Fathers when commenting on patristic commentary, and Roman Catholics do it with the Bible and the Fathers. But the truth is, that's why we're always advocating for reading the full text completely of any church father, because so much of this is just wrong.
And remember, Dr. Overbeck made the comment that you should read the full text of the fathers, you should look at other fathers, you should look at the context in which they wrote it, who were they writing against, who were they writing for, who were they writing to, because those can all affect how you understand the text.
He had a fantastic quote. I think I can find it. Yes, here it is. It's a quote from, I'm not sure if this was from Western Orthodoxy, or if this was from the explanation of Orthodoxy versus all the religions in the world. But this one, it says, unfortunately, it is impossible to the vast majority of Christians to control the testimony taken from the fathers. And even the few who understand Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Armenian, the four chief languages in which the fathers have written their works, neither have time nor a mind to read through the voluminous works of the fathers. Therefore, it has become the fashion to consult some patristic supply stores. So these patristic supply stores he's referring to are like these collected works like Denzinger and other ones. And it says, collected by busy linguistic ants with little circumspection, but with a strong denominational bias. These are the sources of the apparent stupendous learning of the bulk of theologians, who conscientiously propagate the mistakes and misprints of their textbooks without taking the trouble of verifying the passages or finding out their spuriousness or their interpolations. Again, the quotation of a father is scarcely correctly understood if the father himself, his place in history, his friends and foes, his studies and associations, his struggles and defeats or victories, his temptations and occasional faults, his religious life, his passions and virtues, and particularly the origin and drift of the work from which the quotation is taken, are unknown to us.
Is that the end of the quote?
Yeah.
And now it's interesting he brings up about the mistakes and the misprints. And that's interesting because in Denzinger, at least the first few editions into the 1880s, they were printing the First Council of Toledo, which was like around the early 400s. Mm-hmm. It's having the filioque in their creed and in their dogmatic professions. Not the Third Council. Then they later had to change that, but that's you see that in Denzinger. Every time when people pull out a Denzinger, my first initial reaction is, have you actually looked at other, critical manuscript, critical text about it? because I found that I think I wrote somewhere a paper where I pointed out at least 4 or 5 cases of the filioque just being put into the text of Denzinger when it's not in the original manuscripts, and then later they had to put it in like brackets. And if you see something in brackets in Denzinger, guess what? It means it's not there in the original text.
Yeah.
So.
All right, so let's continue on. And where were we up to? Hold on. I went to go get Overbeck's thing, and we're almost at the.
Okay, so Joshua asked the question. Maybe you've already done an episode on this, but it would be interesting to hear about St. Augustine's De Trinitate and talk about its use or misuse by the RCC. Any possible textual corruptions? I know some saints talk about this as a possibility and a proper interpretation. If it's impractical in this time, I think that's a worthwhile topic for the future. Now, that's an interesting discussion because I've tried to find the 2 earliest texts of De Trinitate. One is supposed to be from like the 590s, and another is supposed to be from like maybe the mid 600, like the 650s or so. And they are both in the Ambrosian Library in Milan. All right. The problem is that they're not scanned, they're not online. I don't know how, short of me going to Italy and asking for permission to look at certain passages in De Trinitate, I simply don't know how to look up any of those texts. Because the problem is that once you start looking at texts that are from like the 9th century, that's actually when you start seeing interpolations beginning to go into textual material. And because that's around when the filioque whole thing happened in the 50s, in 860s, all right? So people began to actually interpolate texts into things to kind of justify arguments against St. Photius or whatever, all right? So this is, but again, it's interesting that you can still look at, I think Ethan also posted on the Warzone a quote.
Yeah, a quote from the end of Book 15.
Yeah, and the question is, is what is St. Augustine talking about here and all the rest, so.
Well, and it's interesting because what he points out is that it doesn't seem, based on the quotation near the end of Book 15, that the Holy Spirit doesn't derive his hypostatic identity or existence from Christ, meaning he's simply not caused, which would be the Orthodox position.
Yeah, and I notice also, now, before I go, if you read the first book of De Trinitate, as you recall, St. Augustine makes profuse apology for any mistakes that he's writing this text against a famous Arian named Maximus the Arian, who was like a Vandal Arian bishop, I guess. And he basically says no one else has been writing against him, and I have to do something. And if I make any mistakes, assuming these aren't interpolations, his view is basically go with whatever the church ultimately decides or teaches on this. If I make a mistake, all right, not saying that he was mistaken on all the points, all right. So that's something people also forget, that St. Augustine oftentimes wrote with some trepidation, because for all intents and purposes, he was like the most educated person in North Africa to write against heretics like the Donatists and the Arians and all the the Manichaeans, all the other groups. So he's kind of like, to be frank, out there in the middle of nowhere, being attacked by all these people. All right. And another point, and this happened on the Warzone, and it was the same person doing it over and over again, and they didn't stop, so I had to boot them off the Warzone. Well, they were saying St. Augustine taught the flesh really. He was like, St. Augustine really did teach this. He really did teach this. He really did teach this. I was like, where are you? On all they could quote is some book by some guy, but never an actual primary source quote.
Oh, it's like that guy we had on the show before. He kept quoting that one thing from that listed supposedly.
But it was never a primary patristic quotation. For example, this one person tried to say St. Augustine taught that the flesh was materially evil, that matter was evil. Well, first off, I know St. Augustine. I don't have my copy of his Against Faustus and his later works against Julian and others against here, but St. Augustine was consistent throughout his entire career that physical matter is not evil. The flesh as a material in it itself is not evil, but the flesh, like our flesh, how the scriptures warn us against the world, the flesh, and the devil. The flesh can be infected with sin and evil, but it doesn't make it evil in itself. All right. Just like the passions can infect us, but they're not natural to human beings as human beings. All right. St. Augustine and all the other fathers point out that the devil, Satan, is not in his essence evil. All right. He becomes evil by his will. All right. So all these people saying this stuff, I don't think they know what they're talking about. They're just quoting some 20th century writers who have this overreaction against St. Augustine because they want to promote sexual liberation, which is almost invariably where almost all of this stuff comes from, by the way.
Yeah.
All right, and that's what I seem to have noticed that. All right, and as pointed out, another point, in fact, the summation of Saint Augustine's work against the Pelagians and Saint Prosper's work against some of the Pelagians and others was actually written in something called a Proceedings of the Western Bishops against the Heresy of Nestorius and Celestis, which was actually because Pelagianism was actually in its later stages became overtly connected to Nestorianism. For example, Theodore of Mopsuestia, among many things people did not like him for when he was alive, it just wasn't after he was dead. When Julian of Eclanum, who was like the second stage of like a disciple of Pelagius, he was a bishop of Eclanum in Italy, when he became like the leader of the Pelagians, he was eventually deposed and exiled from Italy. And guess where he showed up? He showed up in Mopsuestia, where Theodore the heretic was. All right, and Theodore kind of like gave him a nice reception and all this other stuff. All right, but Marius Mercator, as I believe, around 449 or 450, translated the, in fact, proceedings against the Pelagians into Greek. And St. Photius in his Bibliotheca, his book reviews, he wrote the first like kind of book of book reviews. He goes through the essentials about St. Prosper, St. Augustine, and he says, you know, these men were divine men and they taught against Pelagius and Celestis. So St. Photius obviously read the work of Marius Mercator, which is a review of the essential teachings of St. Augustine against Pelagians. And St. Photius didn't say anything, basically praised St. Augustine for it. So that may mean that this is why I'm talking about. I think people have an exaggerated misunderstanding of what actually are correct views on things like original sin based off kind of this renovationist mentality that began to enter parts of Orthodoxy in the 20th century. And we, you know, I'll get into that later, but that's something we can talk about with St. Augustine in an episode of it, although we may have done. Adam says, more Hildebrand, but I'm also interested in Orthodox critiques of Calvinist soteriology, specifically regarding justification and sanctification. Now, this is something we were talking about before the program, Father, that...
Well, basically what we can cover is the Synod of Jerusalem, which covers virtually all of Calvinist soteriology as expressed in the so-called Confession of Lucaris.
And remember, because the Synod of Jerusalem has, on the one hand, it has the Confession of Dositheus, which is like a positive but also negative confession to counterbalance, to counteract the so-called Confession of Lucaris. Because after all, I'm actually more inclined to, maybe we don't even know if Lucaris actually wrote the confession, by the way, anyway. But there actually are texts of the Synod of Jerusalem that go through Calvin, that go through in the Acts and critique Calvinist teachings.
Yeah.
So that's something we could have a future program about. Because that book is free online. It's translated on Google Books. You can find it on Internet Archive as well.
We'll definitely provide links. So.
All right. Now, what about this stuff about Padre Pio, Father Joseph?
Yeah, that was something that I was discussing with somebody with Dustin on a discussion. And he was asking about the question of the validity of miracles outside the church, which of course led to this flowchart discussion of whether or not. And he said, well, one of the things that I find when arguing with papists is that in general, with Roman Catholics, is that they're always like, well, what about Padre Pio? And the truth is, I mean, when I was a Roman Catholic, Padre Pio wasn't a saint, but like the Capuchins had little pamphlets about him. Didn't say very much except, a little thing about how holy he was and how he had the alleged stigmata and stuff like that. But, the truth of the matter was I didn't know jack about Padre Pio. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to look up the wiki on Padre Pio just because I don't know anything about him. And I was blown away. The stuff that you learn, first off, he was involved in some of the highest level machinations in the Vatican. He had foes and opponents and backers and people who believed he was a saint, who was alive, people who thought he was a fraud. And there
obviously, as Orthodox, we don't believe he's a saint, but who was he as a person?
And that it's weird because there's so many weird things about him, like this all-female guard he had, where he was accused of having an affair with one, and just all sorts of stuff that made me think. Because even John the 23rd thought he was a fraud, and then Paul the Sixth was like, "Oh, I totally buy into it." And so the thing is, it started to feel a lot like a slower version of what they did with like Mother Teresa, where just the sheer popularity of the individual was good enough to say, okay, let's beatify this person. But I don't know that I would be so quick to say that this was a person of God. I'm very confused about the stigmata. One of the Vatican reports indicated that was caused by necrosis in his hands. Now, necrosis can be induced. Anyone who's ever...
Well, just so we understand, the reason this was being brought up was because somebody was asking you about what about the Roman Catholics bringing up Padre Pio and supposed miracles outside the church.
Right. And the thing is, what I find is that usually the reason why Padre Pio became so interesting to me is because he mentioned that traditionalist Catholics use him as a defense. But he was a supporter of Vatican II. There's no evidence he wasn't. He was obedient to the council. He referred to its spirit and stuff like that. He was literally a Vatican II guy. So I can't see how any trad Cath could even say that. So yeah.
You probably have some who don't like him, actually. I mean,
but at least they'd be consistent. But I think we should do an episode demythologizing Padre Pio, definitely without question. And that's all I'm going to say about that for now, because we want to move forward, and then I want to get to all the questions.
Okay. All right. So Daniel again asks, defending the truth of St. Flavian's murder, Ephesus 2, against Copts who claim he was writing letters months later. Anything about Ephesus 2 with the Latrocinium and its disorder proceedings against Copts who think it's a valid council.
Well, we can include that in the one we do talking about the 3 chapters. But I mean, it's really hard to justify the idea that Saint Flavian was writing letters. First off, one, there are no letters. If there were letters, they would be produced. Secondly, everybody at the Council of 451 already took it as a fait accompli that Saint Flavian had been dead for a couple of years. So that's impossible, because it's impossible to be anything other than he died.
I think some of the Severians claim that, well, he died 4 or 5 days after the council.
Yeah, but still, that just means he died from his wounds. So the point I'm trying to make is saying he lived months later, and that's why when...
Well, remember Severian Zealot, I think, said he lived like a year later.
And we thought that was ridiculous, because there's no proof. None.
Well, what we should do is when we make this program about this, we should, after we finish it, we should then invite Severian Zealot to listen to it, and then maybe have him back on.
Okay, I think that's not a bad idea.
So, we can have his reaction.
All right, and finally, the last one that we have here is, I think the best topic would be the defense of faith against the LMB, I assume that's the LGBTQ movement. It's a current hot topic, and I think it's now a greater threat to the purity of faith than anything else. Honestly, do Catholics and non-Chalcedonians really threaten our faith? No, but the aggressive, cunning LMBTQ propaganda does endanger it. Brace yourself. Well, we do cover that. I don't know
I think they're all a threat, but from a different angle.
Yeah, and the point is, if you're talking about things that relate to biology, you're talking about things that relate to psychology, and they're important. The question becomes, though, it's not a philosophical issue for us. It's not like, that there's if there are people who are endorsing this sort of stuff, I mean, they're losing their orthodoxy. It's just that simple.
Well, you already have the OCA figures like this Father Robert Reeder and his brother Theodore Feldman, the former Reformed Jew who decided he wanted to become Orthodox out of nowhere. They're all supporting this stuff, and did you see the OCA convention had some sort of resolution passed asking all of its clergy to reaffirm the traditional Orthodox teaching on sexuality and etc. And the OCA Synod of Bishops rejected it, saying they didn't think it was necessary to ask the clergy to sign such a document.
Well,
they did it. They did that because they wanted to protect certain people. That's why they did.
The point is, and that's part of that whole, there was a group called Orthodox Christians for Accountability that tried to expose a lot of these people.
I mean, technically, part of the reason they drove Jonah out had to do with that kind of stuff. And, there was also the fact he was an accountant, and he was whining about all the bad stuff going on.
Yeah, it was who was the previous guy who headed the OCA, how he mortgaged basically the seminary for personal expenses, and then he taking $3,300. Anyway,
okay.
So it's we can't. It's not really an apologetics topic, but we do cover it when it comes up. I mean, we have.
Well, I think though, to be honest, it may in fact becoming a necessary apologetic subject because of so much propaganda in the media, everywhere, trying to get people to accept this LGBTQ whatever the alphabet soup they're going to add to it.
Yeah,
Stuff.
and
Transgender,
no, I get
people
that.
taking animal organs and grafting them to
It's not
themselves.
even really about us. It's really about ruining our children. And,
And so, but our children, people's children, and lay people need to be guarded against this because their children, they go to college, any kind of a college, it's not going to be a conservative religious college. They're going to be finding this stuff pushed. I mean, I remember years ago when I was, not that long. I mean, I'll be 35 this year, so it was only like 16 years ago when I was 18 or 19, and I went to. Beg your pardon?
I said that's still a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time. Yeah, I mean, I guess technically I'd be like a millennial or something. I'm not
Just
sure.
except for you're a boomer.
Yeah, I'm not that old. I will be eventually. But I remember taking some classes in a community college, and I couldn't even. One of them. They said you had to write s/he whenever you were speaking about a generic person. All right, so so it's she, he, almost, or something like that.
Really? Oh, s/he.
Yeah. I know that sounds like a minor thing, but I was so upset about it. I dropped the class. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I was like, oh, I'm not doing this. But that's a minor. That's probably like how they were getting the stuff in there gradually.
Yeah, it's little stuff, but anyway, we're gonna okay.
Let's go to the questions in the chat.
All right, so we'll start from the beginning. Jordan Brown, we have that Western liturgical rites question.
Okay, what's the question?
Do you mind comparing the Western liturgical rites used in Rokor, the Antiochian Vicariate, and your metropolis? Also, can you discuss the other ancient Eastern rites beside the Byzantine?
Well, within the Moscow Patriarchate Rokor organization, they allow a lot of stuff, so I don't really know how to.
They allow basically everything because they allow the
Antiochian stuff. They
allow our stuff.
I don't know who. I mean, they only allowed our stuff because they convinced a few priests years and years ago to leave us.
Yeah, but they also have Father Aidan's stuff, which is
which no one uses. So
yeah, and then there's I think a couple of them actually use the Gallican rite. So, they're kind of an alphabet soup of everything. So,
the Antiochian Vicariate basically allows modified Tridentine rite and a High Church Anglican rite. Within our church, we only allow priestism, Orthodox Western rite.
Right. So basically.
So, for example, we do not use. We're not going to have Feast of the Immaculate Heart, no Feast of the Sacred Heart, no Benediction of the Blessed Sacrament.
We don't have any post-schism stuff.
No post-schism saints. We do not have a veneration for Thomas Aquinas or any of these other people. That's forbidden. They're considered heretics by us. We give our communion, our Eucharistic bread is actually leavened bread. It's not like we don't just throw yeast in there.
Wait, does the Church of France use the wafers too, or do they use?
No,
bread?
they use. They've always the Eckhoff has always used leavened bread just like we do.
Oh, okay.
They've always done that.
We've always wondered about that. Okay.
Whereas the Antiochian practice is basically they contract with a company who takes yeast, they put it in the bread, they put it in the dough, then they flash fry it almost, not flash fry it.
Yeah, well, basically
flash cook it, and it kills the yeast, but there's no rising.
Yeah, that's
the important part of the yeast is that it actually causes the bread to rise. That's part of the symbology of the bread. So we don't allow that. We don't do that stuff. We have when we give communion to people, communion is given from the one Eucharistic consecrated bread, which has been broken up into pieces to give to people instead of like individual wafers or such.
Other ancient Eastern rites besides the Byzantine.
But I just wanted to finish. So basically, ours is the priestess Western rite. Our altars, as a rule, are not up against the wall. We do circumambulation of the altars for certain liturgical ceremonies, like cincing the altar, etc. But we could go much more into that. It's just a large subject. But as other ancient Eastern rites, well, there's the liturgy of Saint James and the liturgy of Saint Mark, which are generally this other Eastern rites people are familiar with, if they are familiar with other ones within Orthodoxy that have been used in the recent centuries.
They use them occasionally on feast days.
Yeah, I know that. I know at Jordanville since the 1930s they've been using the liturgy of Saint James, and I think since the 40s maybe the liturgy of Saint Mark. They still do that on those like in the chat, and like sometimes they'll do it in the funerary chapel or something like that.
One of the things to keep in mind is that, like Eastern rites that are being used besides the liturgy of Saint John Chrysostom, we should say, Western rites, if you take out all the post-schism stuff that you see and stuff like that, they're all pretty similar in the sense that they're all basically, they're not derivations of the Roman rite. The Gallican family is different, but when you actually celebrate a Gallican service, if you're using regular Gregorian chant, it's not that different.
Well, but remember, when we talk about the Byzantine rite, what's interesting is that you're talking about a rite that has two different liturgies used throughout the year. Actually, three, because the pre-sanctified, but let's say full liturgies is two different liturgies. So, for example, when Byzantine people use the liturgy of St. James or the liturgy of St. Mark, it's not really that much alien to them in many ways.
Yeah,
because they were already used to the concept of having like a lot of similarity for their ordinary or in many cases. For example, like the liturgy of St. Basil is much longer than the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. And if you look at the mystical prayers of the priest, he prays during the litanies. In the liturgy of St. Basil, they're like 5 times bigger or more than those of St. John Chrysostom.
Yeah.
But it's similar also to the West, like the Mozarabic, the Gallican, the Ambrosian, and the Roman bear similar. They bear the same relation to each other as, let's say, the Byzantine to the Cappadocian, to the Antiochian, to the Jerusalem, etc., etc. Right? Even the Byzantine rite, for example, I'll give you an example. The Byzantine rite kind of came to its fruition sometime in the 11th century. Okay, like I think from what I understand, most of it's not. There have been a lot of changes since then, but like 80-90% of it or more is the same textually. Such. Yeah. But a lot of the material actually was imported from the old Syrian rite used in Antioch, the Orthodox Syrian rite, like the canon of St. John Damascene, for example, obviously. All right. Yeah. St. John Damascene used the liturgy of St. James. That was his normative use, you know. But a lot of the things kind of got, for example, the epimachia, the cuffs that a deacon, a priest, or a bishop would wear, that is not Byzantine. That's something that came into Byzantium probably, we think, in the late 12th and 13th century for bishops, and it got extended to priests, and then finally they started allowing deacons to wear it by the 14th century. All right. But that's all Syrian in origination. All right. So just like in the Roman rite, the same thing happened where like the Gallican rite kind of got suppressed, but then they brought in the Roman rite into Gaul, and they couldn't really just get rid of the Gallican rite because it would have been too controversial. So a lot of the Gallican rite simply was digested into parts of the Roman rite of the 8th century.
Exactly.
All right. And the same thing happened in Byzantium, where a lot of the stuff of the old Syro-Antiochian Orthodox rite simply was digested, for lack of a better word, and survived in the modern Byzantine.
Subsumed, just probably.
Yeah, subsumed, but it melded with it. So it's like but the Romans did the same thing. So like in the 8th century, they'd be like, well, as long as you keep the ordinary of the Mass and these certain things, you can have like extra hymns that are Gallican origination, all this other stuff. But the Byzantine way was almost similar. All right, that you keep like the basic stuff, and they would take in different canons and hymns and things from different other Orthodox rites.
You don't really see a reduction in terms of Western usage until like after the schism, when you start seeing these attempts to shrink or simplify the Roman rite to the point where it is.
Well, that's what's happening in basically the 13th century.
Right, and then by
100 years after the Gregorian so-called Hildebrandian takeover.
Yeah, and people are shocked by Vatican II and what they did with the new Mass. I mean, people were shocked by what they did with Trent. Because Trent basically shrunk everything and turned
and they did it. Pius V's bull called Primum. I mean, you can read it. It's free online translation. It's not that big. I mean, it's basically based upon fallacious and erroneous interpretations of liturgical history.
Yeah.
It says that the fathers of Trent, so quote unquote, the commission had decided that they were going to base the Roman rite now, as the papists used it at that point, one of the oldest and most ancient books.
Isn't this the same thing that the Vatican II people said?
Yeah, but I mean, to be honest, it is the same thing. Though, I mean, to be honest, the Tridentine rite is simply just a very stripped down ancient version. Right? Yeah, it's a similar way of just. It's similar in the sense of flashing before people's eyes the credentials and this is the authority and blah blah blah. The other saying that that's true. For example, and I've written posts about this, how when they did Quo Pimum, it's kind of ridiculous. Did they not read the Leonine Sacrament? Look at the Leonine Sacrament, the Verona book. Maybe, I mean, there were other sacramentaries beside the Verona book. I mean, there was, Padua Sacramentary. There was numerous things are going back to the 8th century, which simply would. What really happened is that the West fell away from Orthodoxy. It lost the grace of the sacraments. It ceased being part of the church. So the Mass ceased to be the real Mass. It became simply, just a show. And so people had. This is why people started going into weird things about the Sacred Heart and the Immaculate this and the visions of so and so, and because they had no real grace and spirituality left. That you see how as soon as the Great Schism, and then the 50 years after that, which completed the Great Schism, after that happens, you see how things change. By the time you get to the 15th century, the iconography had changed, whereas before it had been identical to that of the East. They had gotten rid of communion in both kinds. The Mary priesthood had certainly been gotten rid of.
They just tore apart. So
exactly. So it became like people searching for spiritual nourishment, but they had no real ability to find it.
Yeah.
So they became much more susceptible to their own passions. I mean, this happened to all of us, but if you're outside, if you're in some mega structure that's not the church, calling itself the church, that it's going to be even worse over time.
In that sense, Protestantism almost became a logical outcome.
Yeah, I think it was natural something like that was going to happen.
Which I think leads to.
And the only reason Papism, Roman Catholicism, did not fracture further was because the Counter-Reformation had a circle the wagons mentality, and they intentionally put off discussing a number. For example, the King of France and the French Roman Catholic bishops did not accept full-term papal supremacy as we received from Vatican I.
Yeah.
Okay, but the Pope knew that, but he didn't want to press that issue. All right, because otherwise he might have something bad might happen.
Well, even though the Counter-Reformation did its best to re-strengthen.
Yeah, but all it was able to do was basically. Obviously it's not Orthodox. That first off, that's the big thing. It couldn't fix that.
And Orthodoxy and the Roman Catholic Church were around the same size. It wasn't until right after that they began moving into like Latin America and Asia to try to,
Yeah, and notice that. Interesting, until the Mongol invasions, which happened in the 12th and 13th century, until the Mongol invasions, Orthodoxy was in fact larger than Roman Catholicism, because we had something like, I was reading a source from an Antiochian writer from the 18th century, and he was talking about Antiochian texts that were talking about something like 150 bishoprics in Uzbekistan, modern Central Asia, going to parts of Western China. Because we only hear about the Nestorians, but the Antiochian Orthodox had a tremendous mission out there. But the Mongols just came through and just killed everybody. All right, that's kind of, that was, and then they got to, I think the Mongols even destroyed Kiev at one point and such. So they kind of laid waste to it, and Orthodoxy so when they were done with Orthodoxy, we kind of just became the size of the Roman Catholics. All right, and then the Roman Catholics got a leg up. First, then they lost a lot of their people with the Reformation, like about half of it.
Yeah,
but they made a lot of that up by conversions in Mexico, so-called forced conversions, and then basically Latin America, and then they took over the Philippines, and then they, parts of India. Then they take over India and forced the Nestorians.
It's not even so-called in many cases. A lot of those were forced conversions.
Yeah. Exactly.
The priests were writing back Rome at how horrible they will be.
Yeah. So it was just one thing after the other, obviously. So they were able to only kind of rebound after the colonial expansions of Spain and Portugal.
Yeah.
The
next question, and this is.
But the other ancient Eastern rites, you'd be like the Alexandrian rite and the ancient Antiochian rite. And now there's a Monophysite version of those, and there's an Orthodox version of those. And Saint Nectarius of Pentapolis did work on making sure the liturgy of Saint Mark was in fact conformable to the oldest manuscripts. And by this, we also mean there was also an Alexandrian Euchologion, which had differences from the Byzantine Euchologion, but the differences would be, as I understand it, would be like the difference between, let's say, a Gallican priest ritual and a Roman priest ritual or a Mozarabic priest ritual. Probably 75% of the prayers would almost be identical or very similar, but then you have that 25% that's different. Because even if you look at like a Mozarabic or an Ambrosian or Roman prayer, you can still tell from the Latin of how it's structured, how the prayers are addressed. There's a common understanding of how they're praying.
Yeah.
But interestingly, those common understandings were also shared, obviously, before the schism, but with the East, because they were all part of the same Orthodox Church at the time.
Exactly. So in that sense, there was a lot more free.
Because remember what Saint Photius in the encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarch in 1895, which was written by Anthemus VIII.
Yeah.
He quotes Saint Photius, where Saint Photius says that as long as the dogmas and canons of the church are kept, there can be different usages in the church of liturgies and different types of vestments, etc., as long as there's this common understanding of we all hold orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So
what's
the next question in the chat?
Okay, Protestant, Timer Mildred, Protestant-minded modernism, and then he says, it seems to me there's been a continuous push toward Protestant-minded modernism within the World Orthodox Church and the Brandian Church alike. Not only that, but original sin as Augustine must be adhered to correct. If not, one can be considered anathema.
So those are two separate questions.
Yeah. Two separate.
Protestant-minded modernism, that's stuff like German biblical criticism coming from the 19th century. Who was it, like Freudenstein? I can't remember who was an atheist. I'm not getting his name correct. There are a lot of the Tübingen scholars, etc., and they basically taught that the New Testament and the Old Testament were based upon folklore, legends. The miracles never happened.
Also, the stuff pushed by people like the Jesus Seminar, so on and so forth.
Yeah, but you know what's interesting? Even that Jesus Seminar stuff, a lot of that has come to be discredited, even within like the more mainstream scholar, because a lot of it was just so insane.
Yeah,
got a lot of media attention, but even mainstream scholars who I don't agree with were like, "This is just too far. This is,
even they were like, "This is crazy." But yeah, I think that I think that that's true. I think that
the root of the modernism has always been to attack the historical integrity of the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah.
That's always been because they realize if they can say Moses, the Exodus didn't really happen, and Moses never wrote this stuff, and it's just a bunch of folklore and whatever. They realize the conclusions people will draw then. They will draw the conclusion then, if that's true, if the Old Testament is just a bunch of legends and folklore, these prophecies aren't true, then how can we believe in Christ? Because he talks about how he's coming to fulfill the law of Moses.
Yep.
He talks about how Adam and Eve were real. He talks about the flood. He talks about Jonah.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Exactly, Sodom and Gomorrah. He did not treat these as mythologies and legends and fables that were devoid, that had no reality. And remember what St. Peter says in his epistle. He says, we don't follow cleverly devised fables. All right? So either you have, there's not much choice. Either you have to claim we're following a bunch of fables and legends, or we don't.
Well, I think that unfortunately that especially you find in modernist circles in World Orthodoxy and sadly in Roman Catholicism, they're applying that same kind of methodology to the fathers themselves.
Yeah, well, it's obviously, if you're going to destroy the scriptures, then what are the fathers?
They have to go too.
Exactly, they have to go too, and it's not like, and we've addressed this before. It's not like they're taking. It's not, for example, I'll give you an example of a legitimate use of criticism. By that I mean textual criticism. If you have 15 different lives of St. John Chrysostom, okay?
Yep.
And of those, they agree on 95% of everything, but there's a 5% where they agree on these other different points. If you go through the manuscripts and try to find the earliest manuscripts, that's not denying St. John Chrysostom existed or denying he did miracles and he did all these things.
Right.
That's just saying that there may be interpolations, they may have been legitimate traditions here. We have to figure that out.
It's like what I mean. I hate to say it, but in a sense, the converse is happening with people like the life of Saint Seraphim of Sarov. Because in Russia, I know that among the modernists, they continue to push new things. Like that he thought that like Sarov was going to be lifted up into the sky and stuff like that. And none of this stuff you can find in his earliest lives. They're just being made up as we go along.
In fact, I think Motovilov is the earliest person, was his disciple, and he wrote a lot of what we know about him.
Right. And then people try to say, well, this was Motovilov's spiritual daughter's grandchild, so on.
What his friend said he heard on one night.
It becomes ridiculous. So, that's why you have to go to the original text as much as you can, but that's not modern.
But that doesn't mean we deny St. Seraphim was a saint and did miracles.
Or existed.
Exactly. That's not the same. But that's an example of legitimately looking at problems in trying to see which is the most accurate text, as opposed to saying the text is just a bunch of falsities to begin with.
All right, so going to the next question, which is not only that, but original sin, as
Yeah.
Augustine, must be adhered to, correct? If not, one can be considered.
Now, this is interesting, and I'm going to put in the chat the best dogmatic source on what is the Orthodox doctrine of original sin.
Okay.
And I'm putting it at the bottom of the chat. It should show up. It is the Council of the 418, 419 Council of Carthage, canons 120 through 127, I believe. Okay? These are dogmatic canons. We have the interpretations by St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. These canons, St. Augustine was at this council. This council was part of the Pedalion. It was accepted shortly after it was promulgated. It was translated into Greek. It was accepted through the East and West. It was accepted by the time it was accepted at Trullo in 692. It was basically the acceptance of 419 Carthage at Trullo in 692 was simply recognizing what had already been done. And this council was again accepted at the seventh council. So here is the Orthodox dogmatic teaching on original sin. Let me just read the canons, okay?
You didn't put the link in.
I did. Look at the very bottom of the chat. I didn't. Did it not go?
No, it
Yeah,
did
it did. Do you see the bottom? Okay, let me do it again. Hold on. All right, hold on. I did it. Nothing here. I'll send it to you through Facebook. So
I'll put it up.
I might be having a chat problem.
Yeah, we put it up 3 times. Really sorry, but I just want to make
Okay, there we go. I send it through Facebook. See if you can find it.
Find a better way to say it.
Okay, so Canon 120 of the ecumenically approved Council of Carthage, which is mandated, these are dogmatic definitions, no one can depart from these, are the following. Canon 120, it has pleased the council to decree that whoever calls Adam, the first man created, a mortal man, so made that whether he sin or not, he is bound to die in the body, that is, to depart from the body, not owing to his deserving this fate by reason of the sin, but because of necessity inherent in his nature, let him be anathema. Canon 121, it has pleased the council to decree that whosoever denies the little ones newly born from the wombs of their mothers when they are being baptized, or asserts that they are baptized for the remission of sins, but that they have inherited no original sin from Adam, obliging them to be purified in the bath of renaissance, whence it follows that in these persons the form of baptism for the remission of sins is not true, but is to be regarded as factitious, let him be anathema. For no other meaning ought to be attached to what the apostle has said. Sin entered the world through one human being, Romans 5:12. And thus it passed over into all human beings. Wherefore all of them have sinned. Then that which the Catholic Church diffused and spread abroad everywhere has ever understood those words to mean. For it is on account of this canon of the faith that even the little ones too, who are as yet incapable of committing any sin of their own to render them guilty of any offense, are truly baptized for the remission of sins, in order that what sin they inherited from the primordial birth may be purified in them through the process of renaissance. Canon 122. It has pleased the council to decree that whosoever should declare that the grace whereby we are justified through Jesus Christ our Lord to be effective only for the remission of sins already perpetrated, and not to afford help by way of preventing perpetration of other sins in addition to thereto, will be anathema. Canon 123. I think people can read through those other canons, but I would really recommend it. But I'm going to go through, I want to read the interpretation of St. Nicodemus on Canon 121. It says, this view, too, was a product of the heretical insanity of the Pelagians. That is the view the canons condemning. This refers to their saying that newly begotten infants are not baptized for the remission of sins, as the Orthodox Church believes and maintains. But instead, if anyone says that they are baptized for the remission of sins, yet the infant themselves have not incurred any taint from the original sin of Adam, such as to require to be removed by means of baptism, since, as we have said, those men believe that this original sin is not begotten with the human being, simply because this was not in the offensive nature, but a mischoice of the free independent will. So the council in the present canon anathematizes the heretics who say this. First, because the form of baptism for the remission of sins, which is given to infants, is not true according to them, the heretics, but false and factitious, since according to them, those infants have no sins to be pardoned. Secondly, because the apostle, on what he says, makes it plain that sin entered the world through a single human being, namely Adam, and that death entered through sin, and thus death passed into all human beings, since all of them have sinned just like Adam. This passage, I say, cannot be taken to mean anything else than what the Catholic Church of the Orthodox understood and believed it to mean, to wit, that even the newborn infants, notwithstanding the fact that they have not sinned by reason of any exercise of their own free and independent will, have nevertheless entailed upon themselves the original sin, or if you want to say ancestral sin, the original sin.
Yeah, we should clarify that many people don't like saying original sin, but they say ancestral sin and mean the exact same.
Exactly.
They fall under an anathema because they didn't use the word original.
So the canons, the dogmatic canons state that when infants are baptized, they are baptized not just fictitiously, but really for the remission of sins. And this remission of original sin. All right. So that's the Orthodox doctrine. We do believe in that, people do inherit the original sin from Adam that has to be removed through baptism. I don't know how anybody can. Now, in fact, when I brought this canon up on the discussion on Facebook, someone sent it to someone interestingly who knew Bishop Callistos Ware sent these canons to him, and it was like, well, we don't. You know what he said? They posted the response. He said something like, well, we don't have to believe this any longer. Not everything in the canons. It was basically the modernist response because he knew he was like, you can believe it, you cannot believe it, whatever you want to do. It was an Anglican response. It was a quintessential Anglican response to that.
Just wow.
But the problem is in fact, when I read this canon to somebody one time, and I won't say their name, another person, former Hockner priest, they said that they reject the canon. In fact, this is a well-educated person. He said that this is obviously Augustinianism. I can't understand how it got into the canons of the councils, and so I have no obligation, he said, to accept it. And I was like, well, I'm done. I told him, at that point, I'm done with this guy, but the point was, it
would be a priest that rhymes with.
We're not good. No, I don't want to say any more names, but the point was that I brought this canon up numerous times to people in discussions, and they all seem to be very upset by it, and it's like they don't have any response to it, because they understand what happened is that within modernism, both renovationist forms from the right or left have in fact been introducing, believe it or not, forms of crypto-Pelagianism. Or straight out Pelagianism in many cases.
Yeah, I was going to say it's not crypto; it's just plain old Pelagianism.
Yeah, in fact, I remember there was some article someone sent me where somebody from I don't know where they were trying to rehabilitate Pelagius. They were like, I remember they were like, Julian of Eclanum was. I mean, even though these people were, well, when the Third Ecumenical Council anathematizes a heresy called Celestinism, that's why that's Pelagianism, because Celestius was the chief Pelagian when the Third Ecumenical Council existed. All right, so that's teaching of the church, okay. And you can read through the St. Maximus the Confessor. He has similar things he says, and I think there's a French Moscow Patriot writer who actually has some very good books. I will give him that. And they're very good because he simply quotes the fathers and he sources them very well. His name is called Jean-Claude Larchet, and he goes through this, and if you track down all the quotes and read them in context, it's very clear that the Orthodox Church has always believed in original sin as being transmitted from Adam, and it's not just death. It's not just we have a mortal body and die. It's not just that our bodies, have passions because of the fall. There is a spiritual disease and a spiritual, even to some extent, an impersonal guilt, which is used in some of the fathers that has to be washed away in baptism. It's not a personal guilt. All right, but it's a charge that hangs over us, and this has to be removed through baptism. And if you read the canons, Carthage, if you read the other fathers, it's very clear.
Okay, now, okay, DL writes, hello, even St. John Chrysostom believed in the filioque in the temporal context, read his homily in the Gospel of John.
I think, is he talking about a phrase where he says the Son sends the Holy Spirit, or he goes from the Father through the Son?
The temporal context is not something that we would ever debate.
Yeah, because that's not the filioque in any meaningful sense. Then.
Right, the filioque is the procession or the eternal generation of the Spirit.
We should say origination. Generation would be only the Son. Origination would be a better word.
Well, in any case, the point is, that's the temporal context. We wouldn't even argue with that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the same thing when people bring up quotes about Saint so-and-so saying the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son. Yeah. Like St. Taurasius at the Seventh Ecumenical Council said that. And, and then there was someone in the Frankish court wrote a letter to the Pope St. Adrian and said, how could why did he say from the Son and from the Father and the Son instead of through the Son? And basically, kind of the Pope St. Adrian said, "Look, this is acceptable to say through the sun." It's anyway.
All right.
Anyway,
was Saint Philaret Drozhov of Moscow a Freemason? These guys on Twitter claim so.
That's very interesting. We were talking about that on the War Zone yesterday and today.
Yep.
First off, let me not to denigrate Mitchell Fuller, but technically he was canonized in Moscow Patriarch. I'm not saying he isn't a saint.
I thought he was on our calendar as well.
I do not. He might. We have Old St. Hilarian's Martyrology. He might actually be in there because I think there may have been some rope war people.
I'm not deleting him just yet.
I'm not going to delete him either, but I'm just saying technically, someone could come to me and say that they just think he's a holy man, but not necessarily. I'm just saying that. Okay, but that aside, he was still an important figure that has to be reckoned with nevertheless.
Yeah, and I don't know that we can go so far. I've never seen real evidence.
Yeah. So first off, when I was on if you join the Apologetics War Room or War Zone, there's a discussion we've been having about this. I'm going to bring the post up. My Facebook is kind of slow, so you might be able to find the post faster than I can, Father. But as I recall, until I can find it, there is a Russian Athonite monk currently, Father Anthony of Karulia or Karakia or something.
It's just it's you want me to just read your response?
Okay, so let me find it. See if I can find it first. Okay, go ahead and read it.
Okay, Father Enoch wrote, "This is simply a short and minor response to anti-Orthodox RC polemicist claims about Masonry and Orthodoxy. Some people have accused Metropolitan Philaret Drozhov of Moscow, he died 1867, of having been a Freemason. I know that the Russian Masons claim this. Apparently, some Seta traditionalist RCs claim it as well. I've never seen any convincing evidence whatsoever. A polemical tactic by anti-Orthodox writers seemed to be to claim that everyone who is a Mason who opposed the Vatican and didn't want to be a Union. From what little I can decipher, the claim is that because Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow was a member of the Russian Bible Society, and the Russian Bible Society had Masonic members, though I am entirely unsure if Metropolitan Philaret even knew that these people were Masons, since the Tsarist government in 1822 had banned for a second time Masonry in all secret societies, as I recall. This means Metropolitan Philaret was a Mason. The Russian Bible Society believed it was appropriate to translate the Slavonic Bible into a vernacular form of Russian, albeit of a high literary though comprehensible form. This was opposed by many clergy in Russia who believed Russians should simply read Church Slavonic, though many clergy supported the translation from Slavonic to Russian, without, however, supporting the translation of publicly celebrated services from Slavonic to Russian. This seems to be a guilt by association of the worst kind. At this point, I'm wondering about a related subject. Was Patriarch Joachim III of Constantinople a Freemason, or is that just something the Masons say but they have no real and substantial proof? I myself would believe this about Patriarch Joachim, though the only proof at this point seems to be a French writer claiming this based on claims of the Grand Lodge of Greece in the 1970s or so. If Joachim was a Freemason, then it should be known, but at this point it seems just taking the words of the Masons about their claims for every important person in history being a Mason isn't really enough for many of us. I want more substantial information, and that means not just secondary sources all quoting each other without any real appeal to primary source information.
Now, and to add to this, I know we got to address Mitchell Fuller. They also claim Patriarch Photius of Alexandria, who reposed in 1925, was like a Freemason. But to me, that's the same French writer claims that. But that's even harder to believe because he was like supporting the old calendarist. He was like attacking the Anglican Church. He was like big against ecumenism. He basically regarded Melinius Metaxas as a heretic.
Who definitely was a Freemason.
Yeah, so either Patriarch Photius had been like a Mason back in 1890 and he rejected it, or more likely the Masons just made stuff up about all these Greek patriarchs, knowing no one could claim anything decades later.
Yeah, that's a more likely scenario in this case.
Okay, now about Mitchell Fuller, we did have some responses from somebody I am friends with on Facebook. And let me go through some of these with him. Anton is his name, and he's generally a very good source person. And basically, he just simply brings up, let's see, the first website he says is the Russian Masons claiming this. Well, to be honest, that's not really, they're just claiming it, all right? There's an interview that you can find. If you type in Russian, Metropolitan Philaret Drozdov and Freemasonry or Masonry in Russian on Google search, the first thing that comes up is like a Moscow radio, or Free Radio Moscow, which is like kind of a NATO thing or something, where they or one of the Moscow liberal newspapers.
And they interviewed a Russian Mason.
Exactly, they're interviewing who's saying, "You do know they just canonized Metropolitan Philaret, and he's a Mason with us," and that's like supposed to be big and shocking. Now, Anton says that there may be things in the state archives, but they were only briefly opened in the early '90s. Some people there was apparently a group of books that were written about this. They're in Russian. I don't have copies. I have copies PDF here. I have to go through them. But my thinking is that unless I see much more substantial proof than someone saying he was a member of Labzin's Dying Sphinx Lodge or United Friends Lodge. Now, I was reading something, and I don't have it with me now, where someone pointed out that the reference that Metropolitan Fuller was a member of the Dying Sphinx and the United Friends Lodge are totally spurious. And what is true is that how could he be a member of those as Metropolitan Moscow when first off, the lodge was suppressed technically in 1822. It had actually been suppressed initially under Catherine the Great in 1792. She actually abolished it. She was like, these guys are going to bring like a revolution like in France, and she got rid of them. And then they kind of found their way back, and then the Tsar again suppressed them in 1822. So, and someone pointed out on another website that the reference to Metropolitan Fuller being a member of the Dying Sphinx in the United Friends is that there were these mansions or houses in Moscow that were like libraries and like intellectual salons. And that's what they became after they were suppressed as lodges. And Metropolitan Fuller was invited there on a few occasions to like give a talk about something, all right? And then they could write him down and they could write his name down in the book as visited so-and-so, all right? Yeah. So two of those don't even exist. I think the Polar Star Lodge one, they've never really found any information whatsoever. This is why I've been asking, where can we find the actual texts? So that's problematic. I'm trying to think. Let me get down here. Okay, so Father Athanasius, yes. So there's this Father Athanasius who's an Athonite monk on Moscow Patriarch Athonite monk. He might be a non-commemorator. I'm not sure if he's. But anyway, I don't think he's a non-commemorator, but he's a Moscow Patriarch Athonite monk. And I know he does not like Metropolitan Fuller. He's basically the source of a lot of the things about him being a Freemason. And it goes down to one, again, the claims that he had visited these two houses to give talks, or at least visited somebody in them, but they weren't Masonic lodges at the time. Secondly, it has to do with the Russian Bible Society as a whole. All right. Now, first off, Metropolitan Fuller Drozdov was a member of the Russian Bible Society. He was not president of it. The Russian Bible Society, by the way, was in fact closed down in 1826 because Metropolitan Seraphim Glabovsky, I can't remember his name, was in fact made president of the Russian Bible Society, and he had a lot of problems with the members, not Metropolitan Fuller, but other members, and he closed it down. He basically said, "Look, this is there." And now, if Roman Catholics, I think there are the two people claiming this were, I think, Roman Catholics trying to claim that Fuller was a Mason or something. Well, the Russian Bible Society, even though it was not like a, it was, I hate to use it, it was a quasi, initially kind of had an ecumenical sense to it. They didn't have joint services or prayers, but they kind of invited like the Roman Catholic Archbishop of St. Petersburg to be a member, and all these other all these Protestants. Yeah. And well, first off, you'd have to claim the Roman Catholic hierarchy was all Masonic at the time because they were participating in it, by the way. And what happened is that this created too many problems, as you can imagine. And so eventually, the president of the society just closed it down, and he asked the Tsar to suppress it completely. And that's what happened. So by the time another point, the other argument seems to be that there are translations in the book of Psalms made by the Russian Bible Society that are in fact not accurate, and they are suspect for theological reasons. I think is what Psalm 145, Father Joseph, I can't remember, put not your trust in the princes and the sons of men in whom there is no salvation. And the Septuagint clearly says sons of men. And the Masoretic, if pointed one way, says son of man. And so the claim was that Filaret, by being associated with the Bible Society at one point, and by him supporting a vernacular Bible translation, that he was guilty of this wrong translation and was trying to promote Masonry and Judaism. All right? To me, this is all a very tendacious and tenuous connection at best, because there were more. For example, the Gospels that were translated in the Russian vernacular Bible, I think Metropolitan Fuller only translated the Gospel of John. That's all he ever did. All right. What's true is there were people who wanted to do a translation strictly from the Old Testament Septuagint, and unfortunately, he favored the Masoretic text. Now, I do not believe, from what I can read, He did this because he believed in Judaism or Masonry. He did this because the current scholarly, it was wrong, but the current scholarly consensus, even among kind of the conservative scholars of the time, was that some form of the Masoretic text is more accurate than the Septuagint. And Philaret draws off was a Hebrew. He was a Hebrew scholar, and I think because he was reading foreign literature that was promoting the Hebrew text, he just accepted that. I don't know how much. I know he did write something called the Synodal Responses, which was against this other Metropolitan of Kiev at the time, who wanted to just use the Slavonic or the Septuagint for translation. So the most I can see about these claims, they're based upon tendacious claims about his association at one time with the Russian Bible Society. They sometimes claim that the other point was there was a Father Photius Spassky, who was an archimandrite at the time, who died in 1838. He was born in 1792 and he died in 1838. And Father Photius Spassky was, with other clergy, was very much, as I mentioned, against any translation into vernacular Russian. In fact, if you read The Way of the Pilgrim, in one of the chapters of it, it's like like this elder or monk hands the pilgrim a Bible, and it's like in Slavonic. Mm-hmm. And he says, "I don't understand Slavonic." He says, "Well, just learn." And a lot of the Russian clergy, what they believed was that in schools, people should be given Church Slavonic classes, all right? And you should simply have to learn Church Slavonic. And they did not want Russian being used in any way in religious services. In fact, the closest they would come to is the Metropolitan of Kiev had this compromise where they would take the Slavonic Bible and they would Russify it so it would be more comprehensible. But, you know, they never got really... And I should point out, so that kind of happened. That was kind of the claim that him for a Mason, but I've never seen anything. So Father Photius Spassky made some claim that Metropolitan Philaret is a Mason or he's secretly a Mason, but he never proved anything. He never broke commemoration with him. All right. Now, one of the claims they often bring up this Admiral Shishkov, which is the strangest person they could bring up, who had been an admiral in the Russian Navy, had been a Secretary of State. And he was like negative. He never accused Metropolitan Philaret of being a Mason, but Admiral Shishkov was really negative toward a Russian Bible translation. He believed Slavonic should be taught to people. But Admiral Shishkov was supposedly a Mason. At least he's recorded as being a Mason in some lodge manuscript, from years later. Which to me, when I got into all this stuff, I was reading through various articles. I was having to Google Translate and Wiktionary to decipher, to get through some of the Russian. It seemed to be a very convoluted mess, and but from what I could tell, I don't know if you follow me along here, Father Joseph, a lot of it did not seem to be pointing out people as Masons. It seemed to be more the problem was Russian bishops, like Metropolitan Philaret, who I think was a holy man, were simply influenced by, I think, probably erroneous ideas at the time, that, somehow the Hebrew text could be translated, the Masoretic text, but it would still be perfectly orthodox. If you know what I'm trying to say, but I don't see that as making him a Mason, all right? Any more than it made the Roman Catholics who participated in the Russian Bible Society Masons, because technically they condemned it. I don't know what more to say about it, Father Joseph.
Well, we have a lot more questions. So.
Okay.
Okay, well, DL writes, Lutherans be like faith is the only thing that keeps us in a state of justification because our obedience is a filthy brag to God. If a loss of obedience is a loss of true faith, how does one come to repentance?
By repent?
Yeah, by repenting.
You realize you sinned. You come to resolve you don't want to sin again, and you say and you ask forgiveness, and then you go to confession.
You confess.
Yes.
Timer Mildred, and piggybacking off my last question, if babies contain original sin, they cannot obtain residence within the ultimate heaven.
Well, this is in fact something you find not just in St. Augustine, but you find this in St. Gregory Nazianzen.
Yeah.
I think in Oration 39 or 40 on the Holy Lights. Yeah. And in fact, in the Synaxarion, the Eastern Synaxarion for the readings from Meat Fair Saturday, I believe it's Meat Fair Saturday, or the one before that, or the one after that, they actually state that unbaptized infants do not go to the fires of Gehenna nor to the paradise of heaven, but they go to another place.
That would be
and this would fit in with the concept of what now. In fact, there's a declaration from like one of the Patriarchs' Constantine from like 1722 or 1792, where basically the view is that they go to an upper chamber of Hades, where they experience no pain, and they exist. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be delivered from there. I mean, we have enough in Orthodox literature about children, I mean, not children, but people actually being prayed from Hades. But yeah, that's what you find in the Synaxarian reading. St. Augustine's view is actually not that far off, because we have people like St. Gregory Nazianzen teaching. I think the difference with St. Augustine said that they only experienced the pain from their original sin, where St. Gregory Nazianzen's view was that they neither experienced pain nor pleasure, or they couldn't be rewarded, but they couldn't be punished. And this is somewhat analogous to what later people call limbo. Although limbo itself should not be considered a different place, because limbo is from the Latin limbus, which means exterior region. So it would be like the upper regions of Hades, because Hades is like at least from an anthropomorphic sense, you can think of it like a graduated realm with many abodes as such. So
Jordan asks, I agree with the Hildebrandian thesis, but to what extent did Charlemagne and the Carolinians help move the West away from Orthodoxy? I don't think that they helped move the West away from Orthodoxy at all. First off, Charlemagne was considered a saint. In many texts, he did a lot for the church. And the truth of the matter is, the only real contribution you can really say in terms of what that period did towards moving the West away from Orthodoxy, if we're being honest with ourselves, is the production of the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. And even those, because those became, even though they were written for a completely different reason, they became a time bomb. As that, by the time you get to the Hildebrandians, where you have these delusional ideas about St. Peter and so on and so forth, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals become evidence of something that never really existed, and even though that was never the intent of the writers. So in that sense, I would not say that I don't buy into the idea that there was a huge move away from Orthodoxy. You start to see the introduction of the Filioque in the late period there, but it's only in a few small regions. Rome in general, Rome was declining on its own, but that had nothing to do with, it wasn't doctrinal a lot of the time, it was moral. You still see all the way up to the 11th century, you still see the vitality of Orthodoxy in the West, the same way you see it in the East. You still have the miracle working saints. You still have the same form and the same structure. The only difference was the use of ritual, but even that wasn't that different, because it was so rich and it was so part of everyone's life. It is a very different experience. One thing that we must do if we're to understand the Orthodox West, even from a polemical standpoint, is we cannot imprint Roman Catholicism on it, because you will produce a distorted image.
The other thing is that the discussions that happened in the court of Charlemagne in the 790s in response to things that put the claim of Patriarch Tarisius and a few other things, that I'm not entirely convinced Charlemagne was writing a kind of large theological treatises and tracts and sending them to people. Okay, like other emperors or kings, if his advisors asked him to write something and send it to the Pope, he'd say, "Oh, do you think it's a good idea? And if you do, I'll do it." All right, but notice that after Charlemagne visited Rome and visited Pope St. Leo III. A lot of the language actually, like originally there had been initially kind of negative language about, because remember there had been this horrible translation of the Seventh Ecumenical Council's Horos and Declaration, several acts, which was not received very well, because at one point it made it out like the council was saying that you should give latria to images, and so there was a Council of Frankfurt in 794 which said that there was a recent council held in Constantinople which said that images should be given adoration like the Holy Trinity, which is in fact the exact opposite of what the Council of Nicaea said. Okay, and Pope Adrian, when he wrote his responses to this, he said that you'd be right if that's what Nicaea did. Now, you can already see how much little information they could get in France when they called the Seventh Ecumenical Council of Nicaea the Council of Constantinople. All right? So that's another point. But after Charlemagne's visit to Rome under Leo III, a lot of this criticism just ended away, simply simmered away. And even when they had the so-called 809 Synod of Aachen, where they claimed they put the Filioque in it, even though Leo III had forbade it, if you look at the Royal Frankish Chronicles, I agree with Zernikoff. If you look at the actual text, what it says is that the issue of the procession of the Holy Ghost in the Creed was brought up, as well as various other issues about the management of the Church, and it was decided these issues were too great to be settled by a council, and so nothing was decided. Now, that's interesting because if you look at the Sacramentary of Aachen, which was like 810, less than a year later, if you look in the Nicene Creed in that Sacramentary, there is no Filioque. All right? So that's not even, there doesn't even seem to be any evidence that Charlemagne put the Filioque in the Creed, except by later writers reading and back into things.
Yep.
Right? Now, obviously, it had gotten in there in some places for the German missionaries going into Bulgaria causing problems. All right? In which St. Photius had to respond to. All right?
Were they German or Bavarian? Or?
They were Bavarian. I'm not even, and I'm not entirely sure how. I'm becoming to have a little bit more of a quasi-conspiratorial view of certain events in history. That when things like this happen, it almost seems like someone's trying to provoke an incident to transpire.
Yeah.
See, my theory, and this is just a hypothesis, shouldn't even be a theory, I've been entertaining for a few years, is that there were people in the West who were obviously filioquists, but they couldn't really come out in the open because there was just too much opposition from Rome and other sources to them. So the easiest way to create a situation where you can take over is to do what? To create controversies, all right? To create points of divergence where you can get, someone mad at the emperor in Byzantium or vice versa, all right? For example, there are people, who even claim that St. Photius was somehow working with the East Frankish court to overthrow Pope Nicholas, which actually I used to think was a Roman Catholic conspiracy, but it's probably not. When you consider the fact that Emperor Charles the Bold did not at one time threaten to arrest the Pope and to depose him, because Pope Nicholas and other popes after him were trying to basically uncanonically depose people from sees all over the West. All right, but as we discussed, you have the 879, and both. Now, it's interestingly, both in the 869 pseudo council and then the 879 council, the creed without the filioque was affirmed. Now, the 879 council had even more. It was even, there was forbid any alterations, as you recall, Father Joseph, right? Mm-hmm. So, I think people need to be more realistic, because I've encountered people who their view is that the Franks were never Orthodox, and when you ask them what happened when Saint Remigius, who was a Roman, a Gallo-Roman, when he went and baptized Frankish children, I've asked him this so I say, when Saint Remigius back in 495, when he baptized a Frankish infant or a Frankish man who was sincerely wanting to become a Christian, what happened? And they will just say, they won't say anything, because there's a lot of this attitude.
The line has to end somewhere, and that's exactly.
Well, that's my point. So when do they cease being Orthodox? If they say they never were Orthodox, what do you mean? What did Saint Remigius do? Was he a fraud? Was Saint Gregory the Great a fraud? Because they seem to be saying that Rome was Orthodox, but everybody else was heretics under Rome.
And you can see, therefore, how the renovation sounds a lot like regular modernism.
Yeah, but that makes no sense. You're claiming that Pope Saint Adrian the first in the 790s was Orthodox, but the Franks were all heretics. If that's true, then how can he be? You cannot be an Orthodox bishop and a saint and having known heretics. Now they claim, well, he was afraid of them. Well, I'm sorry, the saints and the martyrs throughout history weren't afraid to step up and say what the truth was. So either he viewed them as heretics or he viewed them as Orthodox. And if he viewed them as, and if they had problems, he may have just said, well, we can solve and work through these issues over time. But that happens throughout church history. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't mean that whole church is separated from Orthodoxy immediately. All right, and it's just a ridiculous understanding of history for these people to talk like that. All right. Now, DL says, do the Western rites remove the Mysterium Fidei from the words of consecration? The Mysterium Fidei creates a schism. No, we do not remove them. The priests, when we believe, of course, the consecration happens with the epiclesis, but in the words of institution for the chalice, it's obviously this, what the priest says, this is the New Testament, my blood, the mystery of faith, which I shed for you and for many for the remission of sins. So yes, that is part of the Roman rite. Now, I should note, Mysterium Fidei, as part of the narration institution, word of institution for the chalice, is distinctly Roman. It does not exist in the Mozarabic or the Gallican rites, or even in the Ambrosian, unless it's under Roman influence.
Now we get to Jordan Brown's question. Do you have any links I can check out to view, learn about the priests and Western rites you use? I can't find anything on YouTube or your Metropolita's website. Well, there's a sister YouTube channel called Western Orthodoxy.
I have one video on it, but it's like a video about the Orthodox popes.
Okay.
So,
well, let me get the link. I mean, basically, if you look at the Facebook page, Western Orthodox Liturgical Texts and Materials.
Oh yeah, you're right. There's a Facebook group I have
section, and you can see like masses and lots of other fun stuff. All the liturgical services, and also the rites. I think rites of Orthodox is Let me see. Hold on.
I don't even know if that site's up anymore.
It should still. Well, it seems like
I don't know.
Removed from Blogger these days. Hold on. Yeah. If you go to orthodoxengland.blogspot.com, also a lot of the propers of saints and so on and so forth in the Western Rite, as they were done before the Schism and have been translated by our Synod, exists. There's literally thousands of pages of material from those two links alone.
I mean, if you join the Western Orthodox Liturgical Text group, you can get a lot of that for free. I mean, we give this stuff away for free in PDF format. You can buy a formatted version on Lulu, which is very goodly formatted.
Yeah, they're very nicely done, but you can also get it free. So
exactly, you can get a PDF for free.
Free is always good.
Also, what should someone do if there isn't a true Orthodox church near him, her, currently attend a World Orthodox church? Well, as true Orthodox, I'd say that this is not much of a different problem that people face throughout the rest of the world.
Yeah. What you should do if we're going to be, you say that's it, I'm done with World Orthodoxy, I've had it. If you're going to do that, my suggestion is, because you still have to do what people did in the old days, which is, frankly, they said Typica until they could get to church. So to say Typica, there are rules for Typica. Or you say that in the Western Rite it's called Missa Sica, but basically the idea is the same. You're reading the epistles and the Gospels of the Sunday, and some of the variable prayers. Ultimately, though, what I have found is that you should reach out to true Orthodox communities. You should reach out to true Orthodox clergy and frankly bishops, and talk to them, because there's a lot more true Orthodox in the country than people realize. I mean, even in the U.S., what is it like? There's like 75 to 100 parishes here, so it's not like it's not as difficult to find as one would think.
It used to be, but if you live for example, if you live in the metropolitan area of New York, there's probably. There was somebody. I remember somebody contacted us and they said, "Well, I don't know where to go." And there's like a true Orthodox church 5 minutes down the road from.
Yeah, there was literally a true Orthodox church that was 5 minutes from his house. So you have to look around. But if you need help, finding one in terms of location, just you can always tell us where your general metropolitan area is, and I'll see what we can find.
So what do we have next?
DL says Dictatus Papae Canon 25 says the Pontiff of Rome can depose a bishop without a synod. Is there dogmatic canon law prior to Dictatus Papae that says a bishop cannot be deposed without a synod? Yes, there is, because you cannot depose.
The canons of Carthage from 418, 419.
You cannot depose a bishop arbitrarily. You can't even depose. You can't depose priests or deacons arbitrarily. They don't require a synod, but they require at least.
Well, they can. Now it can almost be a synod. Now to depose a priest, you need 6 or 7. You need at least 6, maybe 7 bishops. To depose a bishop, you need 10, 12 or 13 bishops.
Right, and to depose a deacon.
And by the way, the judge cannot. So the 12 judges who are the jury also cannot be prosecutors as well.
Exactly.
And this is in fact one of the problems people oppose the Dictatus Papae over. We're saying, well, if the Pope wants to depose you, he's going to be judge, jury, and executioner.
It's impossible to do, and it was considered illegal then when the Dictatus Papae was written, which is why the Synod of Brixen was held.
So I would say the whole corpus of canon law from the local and ecumenical councils.
There's a lot. If you look in the holy canons of the church.
So look at the canons of the Council of Carthage first.
Okay, so
now Ramble says, why do the Orthodox have a longer Bible canon than what the Council of Carthage listed?
Did I miss that one? Yeah, I did miss that one. Sorry, Rambles.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. The Apostolic Canon 85 also lists different other books in the Bible, and this has to do with like the deuterocanonical books mostly.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that different ecclesial communities.
Although interesting, you remember that the Clementine Vulgate, up until at least the 1600s, was like almost identical to the Slavonic canon.
It is, yeah. It's actually still is the Clementine Vulgate.
But then when you have the Challoner revision of the Roman Catholic Bible in English, he took out all the extra deuterocanonical books and left only a few of the deuterocanonical books in.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
And the Slavonic are actually in full agreement. It's really,
and then the Georgian I think the Georgian editions of the Bible had like Fourth Esdras too. Although I don't know, Fourth Esdras may have been in one of the Slavonic and Clementine Vulgate, because St. Ambrose, interestingly, quotes Fourth Esdras and regards it as a very valuable text. Interesting. So
now, related to that, Ramble says, is the Apocalypse of Ezra to Ezra actually believed to be written by Ezra by the Orthodox Church?
I think I'm confused. See, this is why I'm getting confused. I know when some people say Second Esdras, they mean what I mean by Fourth Esdras, and is the Apocalypse of Esdras the same as Second Esdras, which is the same as our Fourth Esdras? Yeah. I'm not too sure. From what I understand, that there's this view that it's a valuable book, but it's like, why was it included in like the extra deuterocanonical books? I know there are some people like St. Ambrose certainly believed it was accurate and was written by St. Esdras. So I don't think there's an orthodox doctrine on it. I don't think you can be, as far as I know, you cannot be excommunicated for believing Esdras actually wrote the book. If that's the same one I'm thinking about.
Yeah. So let's see here.
Because this goes to the how do you define the canon? Because we have the scriptures of the Old and New Testament, what are called the canonical scriptures, and then we have the authoritative deuterocanonical scriptures. Then we have kind of like almost like a third canon, you might say, Father Joseph, with these kind of extra other books that kind of extra wise get in there, and but that's a little bit different. So okay. I'm a set. Someone says they're a set of a conscience discerning Eastern Orthodoxy. Well, remember, there's also there's only one Orthodoxy, Eastern and Western Orthodoxy. Yeah. So scholars believe the Second Esdras was written after Christ. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Father.
Oh, no, well, we were just discussing that. So,
they believe that because there are prophecies in the book that talk about the Messiah as being the Son of God.
Yeah, that's not necessarily.
Though there are some interesting other scholars of 2nd and 3rd century BC Palestinian religious texts will point out that there is mentions of a figure called the Son of Man and the Son of God. Well, first off, the Son of Man is mentioned in Daniel, but there's in fact mentions of a figure as like the Son of God mentioned in some Palestinian religious texts from the 3rd century BC or 2nd century BC. So that in and of itself, the reason they give wouldn't necessarily make it not written by Esdras.
Yeah. Okay, and then let's see here. Then the next question. Let me see. It says, interested in the answer. Okay, hi, Mickey Mick. Only Thomistic Catholics believe in eternal inspiration. DL. No, that's incorrect. Actually, I can quote from the New Roman Catechism, Part 246, which specifically says the Latin tradition of the Creed confesses his the Father and the Son. The Council of Florence in 1438 explains the Holy Spirit is eternally from Father and Son. He has his nature and subsistence as one from the Father and the Son. He proceeds perfectly with one principle and through one inspiration. And since the Father is through generation given to the only begotten Son everything that belongs to the Father except being Father, the Son also has eternally from the Father from whom he is born, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Son. Now I can go to the Roman Catechism, but the point is it's not just Thomistic Catholics. That's their rule.
I mean that's the official. I mean, I know there have been. I've encountered some Roman Catholics on Facebook who on discussion groups.
I don't believe in it. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, I don't have to believe in it, and like,
yeah, we do. In any case,
and they're also the same ones saying that Vatican I didn't really teach what ultramontanism too. I've heard that before. So.
Let me see here. Yeah, one could use it to, yes, I would agree that Dictatus Papae basically gives the Pope ultimate power. And unfortunately, you see that reflected in later editions of canon law and so on and so forth.
We also, I mean, you got one guy in charge of everything and no one can really do anything against him. What could go wrong? Yeah, I mean, exactly. Of course, yeah. I mean, even. So.
And we have 3 different comments on the Masoretic text. Rambles, Atomic Lead, and Caden say, is the Masoretic text that bad? Maybe you should do a video on the different text type and which one's the best. Honestly, Atomic Lead says the Masoretic text was made by Jewish texts from the 6th and 10th prophecies to falsify Old Testament prophecies of Christ. And then finally someone asks us, can you do a video on the problems with the Masoretic text?
Well, first, I think people don't even understand. I'm not endorsing the Masoretic text.
None of us are endorsing it.
I'm just trying to say that the reasoning Metropolitan Fulleret of Drozdov of the time may have favored it was because, you know, he was a Hebraist scholar and whatever. It was erroneous, but I was just bringing it up as to why it didn't make him a Mason.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about the KJV. It continues with Atomic and Rambles. Yeah, we'll do a show on the Masoretic.
And also, we got to remember that if you take the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, and remove all the pointings, it can mean you can, for example, Psalm 109. If you just have the Hebrew letters without the points, the vowel points and such, if you point it one way, it says what the Septuagint says. If you point it another way, it says, guess what the Masoretes say it says. Like the Masoretes are the ones, as I understand, who put all the vowel points in there. Now, and interestingly, in earlier editions of the Masoretic text, they were like these little notes at the bottom of the text, believe it or not. For example, do you have, I have my headphones on, I can't get to it. But if you go to Genesis 4, I believe, which is where Genesis, I think, is it Genesis 3 or Genesis 4, Father Joseph, that has the Cain slaying Abel. Yeah. All right. And there's an interesting question there about when it says, and Cain and Abel went out into the field, and there's a text missing where a transitive verb should be, all right? And the KJV translators kind of just omit that they do something strange with the text that makes it flow naturally, right? But the early Masoretic texts actually had a note at the bottom saying that this extra word was there in many texts. Now, later editions didn't really care about that. Now, Atomic Lead, I think, is accurate that how they pointed it, how they picked certain texts. They wanted to pick the text, the Masoretes did, that would be the least conducive to leading to Christianity. Oh, that being said, I think the problem is even after all the Masoretes did by corrupting and messing things up, I can still read the Masoretic Old Testament, in the which is essentially almost the King James Old Testament, for lack of a better word. And I can still see the prophecies of Christ heavily in there, all right, because they can only do so much to the text without getting too much, destroying it completely, all right, you know, and so I mean, so that's interesting. And there's also the Peshitta, of course, you know, and there's a lot of other texts. So, but again, I think the Septuagint and the old Latin Bibles because by the way, one of the reasons Septuagint. So now, it's interesting to note that the book of Daniel, as existed in the Septuagint before the 2nd century, is not the book of Daniel as we use in modern Septuagints in the Church adopted, which is interesting. That in the 2nd century there was a man named Theodotion, who I think was like, maybe he was Jewish, or I'm not quite sure. He made a translation of the book of Daniel again from Hebrew text. They may have been pre-Masoretic into Greek, and the translation was considered so good the church just simply adopted that version of the book of Daniel. Now, Atomic Lee says, does KJV say in that psalm, like a lion, my hands and my feet, or they have pierced my hands and my feet? I think the King James does say they have pierced my hands and my feet. I think they do say that, because I think the King James translators had some sense about things. Again, I think that's another issue of how you point texts, but Septuagint is obviously still preferred, and you got to go down a list from there if you're going to make any other investigations. So,
let's see here. Are you aware of Kabani? So Charlemagne's school is not considered a heretic by Orthodox. I don't know of anyone who considers Charlemagne a heretic except modernists. But in any case, I don't think you have to consider him a saint. Frank, I don't.
They were local calendars that considered him to be a saint.
Yeah, but he's not I don't think anyone considers him.
He died in communion with the church.
Yeah,
and whatever the church wanted him to do, he died. He didn't resist.
Want to get rid of Charlemagne. Are you aware of Kabani? He's a pretty good Orthodox Apologetics channel. Yeah, I've actually known about him for years and corresponded with him in the past. He's actually on our group, but he doesn't say much. He mostly writes his own essays. I
think he's going to college right now.
Yeah, I think he's in college. So. He started very young with his apologetic, which is great. Let's see here. Jordan says, I'm in Tampa Bay, Florida. for help finding a true Orthodox church. I prefer Western Rite, but I think most are in the Northeast. I don't know how far you're willing to travel. There's technically the Synod of Kalinikos. They have a church in Clearwater called the Dormition of the Theotokos. And then they have the St. John of Kronstadt mission in Bunnell, which is a little further up. But
we have a mission in Florida, too.
Yeah, we have a mission in where exactly? I'm trying to remember. Hold on. Ours is Western, right, I think.
Father Anthony, he's Western, right?
Yeah, it is.
Hold
on a second. I'll see if I can find it. Jacksonville. Okay, so Jacksonville's North Florida. Bunnell is closer to North Florida. That's actually, I know the priest there, he actually baptized.
Is Tampa Bay in South Florida? I don't know the geography.
Tampa Bay is Central Florida.
Okay.
So the closest one would probably be Clearwater, because that would literally be like 10 miles away from it. So basically, that's fairly close. But in any case, let's see here. Okay, I'm a Trinitarian and was wondering if you would consider having a friendly brotherly discussion / debate. Hey, Luke, do you have an email I can reach you at? Well, we're Trinitarians, so we're not sure what you
That's pretty broad. A lot of people believe in the Trinity.
I'm not sure what exactly you want to debate. I mean, talk to us about it. Well, if you have a topic and you have some sort of background, I'd see if we can help. Timer says, I'm meeting Bishop Alexios on Monday, Fathers. Does he even have an active church?
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. Are the Deuterocanon books part of the Old Testament and good for doctrine, or is it just to be read?
Well, they're good for doctrine and to be read.
Are there any links to a page that consists of the canons of Carthage? I believe we put that up earlier.
Yeah, I'll try to post it again.
Yeah, just post it up again. Yeah, I see it here. Passaic Russian Church. It's the one that starts Passaic Russian Church has that. Let's see. Ramble, St. Jude. Okay, that's a discussion with each other. Topically speaking of the LXS, do the Fathers or Orthodox generally accept the idea that Simeon in Luke 2 was one of its translators? The history of the LXX, I would assume if he was one of the 70 translators, which is the traditional story, I would assume that he.
I think the idea was that he supposedly doubted how could a virgin give birth, and God, the traditional story, one of the stories is that God said, you're going to live until you see the Messiah. So,
was Alfred the Great a saint?
People ask this a number of times. They say he's one, and I don't know when they made him. I don't know when they made him one in the Roman Catholic Church. I don't know if that's something that they've done in the past 30 years. He certainly was an Orthodox king of England in the 10th century and 9th century. But the fact is, there was never a movement to make him a saint in the Anglo-Saxon period. Just people liked him, but they just didn't think he was a saint.
You found more evidence that Charlemagne was a saint.
Yeah, I mean, for example, Alfred the Great. I mean, I know that there's this book by Father James Thornton where he says Alfred the Great is a saint, but that just may be people like him being a saint because he's an Orthodox king. I'm not saying he isn't a saint, but his biographer, who was Bishop Asher, who was a Welsh bishop, he had very positive things saying in his biography, but he portrayed him as a very good Orthodox Christian king. But there was just never a move to have him made a saint. There was a move in the Roman Catholic Church in the 15th century, but it kind of went nowhere.
Yeah.
So if they've done it recently, that's a recent thing. I'm not attacking Alfred the Great. I'm just saying, maybe he is a saint, maybe he's not, but I'm just saying he's not on the calendar.
Does the Pope, this is Caden Bush, does the Pope, if he confesses the Orthodox faith, have a limited primacy? I see a lot of Orthodox claiming the Pope has only a primacy of honors, yet others say he is Archbishop of all the churches. Well, Archbishop of all the churches is an expression. It doesn't necessarily mean he has jurisdiction over all the churches. He's still bound and subject to the canons. So if he's an Orthodox Pope, that's not a contradiction. Technically,
well, first off, if Pope Francis said he confessed the Orthodox faith, he could just not be received as is anyway.
Yeah.
And first off, I don't think we would trust Pope Francis even if he became Orthodox to be an Orthodox Pope.
Well, I mean, let's assume a massive move of people attempting.
You'd have to select a whole new guy, So.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so it would be a really tricky thing. But I think he was talking about an actual pope who is Orthodox. I don't think he was talking about a pope converting to
Well, he'd be first among the patriarchs,
yeah,
and
he could probably
he'd have appellate jurisdiction based upon canons of Sardica.
and he'd have a whole bunch of nice titles, one of which would probably be Archbishop of all the churches, since they use something similar for the ecumenical patriarch. But that would be it.
DL says in chapter 55 of 1 Clement 80 AD, he refers to Judith as blessed. He puts Judith 830. Well, we accept the book of Judith, so we got no problem with that.
And Timer says, dealing with Marianology, we reject the Immaculate Conception, obviously, but is it dogma that Mary did or did not sin? It's pretty much dogma she did not sin. She could have been tempted by sin. I think St. John Chrysostom kind of implies that. But I don't think because we teach that she's immaculate. We do teach that. She wasn't conceived immaculate, but we do teach that she's all holy, pure, and spotless, and the mother of our God. That would be, but it would be by choice, not by divine election.
You can read St. John Maximovich's book, Veneration of the Theotokos.
Yeah, definitely the Orthodox Veneration of the Theotokos. Let me see if I can, because that's online too.
Okay. So, yeah, you're referring to Rambles. Okay.
You were referring to what? I missed it.
They were having a discussion about the Book of Judith, and
okay. Hold on. Let me find the Orthodox Veneration of the Mother of God. Okay, yeah, here we go. All right. Here, so a church website put the whole thing up. So I suggest reading that. That will give you a very smart, setup for that book. It's very nicely done. It has links there and stuff like that. Let's see here. So yeah, I think we've covered everything, and we managed to do it before 11. Unless there's more questions.
Wait. He's saying the Russian website seems if it isn't directly quoting the canons. Yeah, it is. Hold on, my dogs are barking. Go to the DL. Go to the website and go to Canons of Carthage. Okay, do you see where it says the Council of Carthage, the Regional Council of Carthage? Hold on for a second, Father. Okay.
Are most
all right? If you go to
communion with each other, if not, why not? And what are the main things needed for World Orthodoxy to come back into communion with True Orthodoxy? Well, first off, most of the True Orthodox churches in the world are in communion with each other, but there's two main divisions of True Orthodox jurisdictions. One is ours. One would be the Union. The other one would be the Union of the Russian Church of Grado Dragofangel, the Kalinicus Synod, and with their Bulgarians and Romanians.
Okay, so DL, you're going to the Regional Council of Carthage, right?
I'll get back to the question in a second, Jordan.
Okay, so what happens is here's how it's set up. You have they have the canons, and then you have an interpretation by the St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. You don't have to read the interpretation if you don't want to, but you can read the canons. Canon 1 of the Regional Council of Carthage says true copies of the rules laid down as being kept, etc., etc. Do you see that? Okay, so I'm not sure what the problem here is then. If you could probably type your issue out what you're having with understanding it, and I'll let Father Joseph finish answering the question there.
Yeah, and so basically, they're not the two groups and a few other smaller jurisdictions are not in communion with each other. Although that's a situation that's changed radically from just 10 years ago when none of the True Orthodox jurisdictions were in communion with each other. So that's big progress. But the main things needed for World Orthodoxy to come back into communion with the True Orthodox, among some of the non-commemorators, they think like us. They do their best, and I don't think there's much that separates us. Among people who are really ensconced into it, the problem is you're going to have to get rid of the ecumenists and modernists, is what it comes down to, and that is at least at present, really, really difficult. But the beauty of, I hate to say it, but the good thing about ecumenism and modernism is that they're heresies that have no, what's the word I'm saying? They're almost, and I hate to say that to refer to them as almost effeminate heresies, but they have no way to reproduce. And what I mean by that is when you destroy a person's zeal for faith, when you destroy a person's zeal for Christ, either through ecumenism, where you basically say all religions are the same, or through modernism, where you say none of it's real, your children aren't going to become Orthodox. They're not going to stay Orthodox. And that's why they're dying. And that's why we're growing.
Okay, so Deal says, which canon addresses a pope deposing bishops without a synod? Wikipedia seems to say that Canon 39 says the Roman Pope cannot interfere with North African matters. Well, if you look at Canon 12, it says if any bishop fall liable to any charges, which is to be deprecated, and an emergency arises due to the fact that not many can convene, lest he be left exposed to such a crime, these may be heard by 12 bishops, or in the case of a presbyter by 6 bishops by his own, or in the case of a deacon by 3. So you have to depose a bishop, you need 12 bishops. To depose a presbyter, you need 6 bishops, and to depose a deacon, you need 3. I think what you're thinking is that why didn't they mention the Pope at all? Well, they didn't mention the Pope at all because they didn't think they needed. He had no authority in these matters. I think what's happened is people are reading. They're trying to read Roman Catholic interpretations into all the ancient canons. Like, why don't they mention the Pope here? Or if they didn't mention the Pope, it means the Pope still does have the power, even if he's never mentioned. If you see my point, Father Joseph.
Yeah.
Canon 39. Now remember. There's slightly different numberings of the canons between different editions. So I would simply say, DL, read the canons of the local councils up here, or the ecumenical councils, and see how much mention you find of the Pope. You'll find it in Sardica, his appellate jurisdiction, but besides that, you'll find little to no mention.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if the Estonian. I thought that they were.
Well, the ecumenical patriarch one uses the new calendar.
Well, no, but the Finnish church uses the actual Gregorian calendar. I
think the Estonian one uses the. I think they both do, because technically, if Estonians and Finns are almost exactly the same people, their language is almost indiscernible.
They're similar people, but I don't think they.
Well, almost exactly the same. A Finn can understand Estonian almost exactly.
Yeah.
Even they both even have the Kalevala as like under slightly different names as like their national epic.
No. I understand. I went to Finland.
You went to Finland or Estonia?
Finland. They even had a joke which was really tacky.
Okay. What was the tacky joke?
Oh boy. Well,
if it's not appropriate, don't tell me.
It's inappropriate, but it's kind of like there's kind of an Estonian. It's an Estonian joke, and the point is Estonians don't like Russians. So the joke was, at the beginning of time, people saw that across the waters was this great land, and so those who saw the sign saying "Here's the perfect land" led to the waters. They got across, and they went and they saw this beautiful land, and they became Finns. And the people who stared across at the sign about this perfect land but didn't want to cross the water and felt bad and thought how horrible life was became Estonians. So the people who couldn't read were Russians.
But the people couldn't read with the Russians?
Yeah. So,
okay.
The point is, that's why I thought it was a rude joke.
All those Europeans have kind of jokes about each other.
Well, yeah, and Russians make jokes too. And there was.
Well, the Ukrainian joke is that Russians are lazy and they don't work very hard. Actually, I've heard that. And like Ukrainians will say you don't want to marry a Russian because there's, and I think Russians say stuff like Ukrainians are like country bumpkin. Morons, and they're like hillbillies. That's.
Well, yeah, it's I can tell.
Anyway.
Well, anyway, so yeah.
What are the non-commemorators? Non-commemorators atomically, they are people. There are several stages. A non-commemorator, in the simplest sense, is someone who ceases commemoration of their bishop because their bishop is teaching. They say their bishop is teaching heresy, publicly condemned heresy. The first group, now, non-commemoration arises whenever there's a heresy. For example, the archimandrites around Constantinople ceased commemoration of Nestorius when he and his chaplain Anastasius began preaching Nestorianism. In a modern sense, non-commemoration again happened in the 20s with the old calendarists, and then again it broke out or happened again in the 50s and 60s on Athos. And the modern sense in which people talk about non-commemorators are members like of the Moscow Patriarchate and places in Mount Athos and in Greece and a few other places in Romania who basically stopped commemorating their patriarchal bishops because of the either the Havana Declaration of Kirill or because of like the Synod of Crete. So, to some extent, they would agree with us, the Orthodox, about some points.
But then they always say, "But we're bigger." And so,
yeah, or I had one of them tell me I have the cease commemoration of my bishop. I was like, well, then I have to join them, and I was like, well, if I'm not, I was very confused at their logic, because I was like, well, then where do you get new priests from? If you're saying your bishops are now heretics, who do you get to ordain you now? Because they have this, a lot of them have this attitude that you can cease commemoration, but you can't make new. But it doesn't say you can set up a new synod. Well, then where do you get your new clergy from? If people if you can't can celebrate with them, why can you suddenly accept ordinations from heretical bishops? It doesn't make much sense. It's like when the Alexandrian patriarch got apostatized, they actually had to set up a new patriarch of Alexandria back in the 540s at one point. So when the same thing with the Antiochians and others, and for example, when the Melkites when the Antiochian patriarch had apostatized to papism in 1724, that was the Melkite schism. The surviving Orthodox bishops, priests who didn't go along with the vast majority, basically ceased commemoration of the Antiochian patriarchate because they're like, oh, this guy's a heretic. But what do? They went around and they found Orthodox bishops in Asia Minor. Basically, went to Constantinople and said, look, can you make some of us bishops? So, non-commemoration at a certain point does mean you have to set up a new synod to handle cases and matters, or you're going to cease to be, because who are you going to get to ordain you? Fireman Mildred says, what of the slaughter of the old calendars in Greece? Yeah, that happened in the 20s and 30s. The state government of the state oppressed them, us. It kind of partially ceased in 34 because the Masonic liberal government, the Venizelos government, kind of fell and the king came back. But there was the state church never really liked it. There were various attempts to change the calendar back to the old calendar. I think there was this one archbishop in like 1957 who wanted to do it, but he kind of fell out of power. I don't know all the stuff. I know that there's a lot of stories from the 20s and 30s about, old calendar's priests being tortured in the basements of police stations in Athens and such.
Well, we definitely can cover that on the next show. There's more.
Oh, he's giving suggestions. Oh, I see. Okay. That's right.
So definitely we'll cover that. We'll definitely talk about the old calendars. To answer the last question, is there a cutoff for saints that TO recognized? Does it vary by jurisdiction? It does vary, and it does. I'd love to answer that next week. Father Sharp from Rose is a very interesting thing.
Atomic Lee says non-commemorators sound like they're in an uncomfortable SSPX position of wanting to have their cakes and eat it. Well, they're actually worse because SSPX claims they have bishops and can make new bishops. Non-commemorators don't have that option. They have no bishops who are with them. So, they're actually, I think, in a worse position.
All right. Well, in that case, I think that we'll definitely get to your question next week, Timer, next show, and because it's already 11:07, we've been on for just about 2 hours and almost 10 minutes. So
okay,
we're gonna take off for now. Everyone have a great night. Thank you again for listening. Thank you for being there. We will look forward to next week, God willing, and happy feast to Saints Peter and Paul upcoming on
Benedicite.
Oh, Friday, guys, Friday. That's when it's